Good afternoon from Tokyo. I'm Jeffrey Ordaniel, Assistant Professor of International Security Studies at Tokyo International University. Welcome to the sixth edition of TIU Global Dialogue. During the last session, moderated by my colleague Chris Lamont, we discussed the challenges of human rights promotion in Myanmar with our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Tin Muang Muang Tan of the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission. It took place just some days before the Tatmadaw, or the Myanmar military, seized power through a coup. Of interest to many scholars, experts, and pundits are the responses of not just the major powers, like the United States and China, but also of the region's preeminent international institution, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, of which Myanmar is a member. For some, the crisis in Myanmar is an opportunity for ASEAN to prove its worth. For others, especially the critics, the initial response of the regional grouping demonstrates its inherent flaws and limits as an institution. Indeed, ASEAN has grown to become one of the most important international organizations in the world. For the optimists, the association, through its various dialogue institutions, is not only critical in advancing peace, stability, and prosperity in Southeast Asia, but also in helping stabilize the wider Indo Pacific region amidst the rapidly changing geopolitical and economic environment. From China to the United States and from Russia to Japan, ASEAN regularly convenes many of the world's most powerful states to promote cooperation in many pressing issues. Its 10 members continue to insist on ASEAN centrality. But the pessimists have doubts. ASEAN's perceived inability to unite on the South China Sea issue and alleged failure to protect human rights are just some of the many issues raised by critics. The initial response of ASEAN to the current crisis in Myanmar is being cited by some or used by some to advance the idea that, perhaps ASEAN is indeed overrated, that when it comes to big, high stake issues, the regional grouping is just inherently infirm. This lingering debate begs some important questions. Will ASEAN continue to be relevant in the evolving regional order? Can it deal with the complex US China strategic rivalry? Should it reform the so called ASEAN way that includes non interference in domestic affairs and consensus based decision making to better cope with 21st century realities and maintain its centrality? Today, we will discuss ASEAN and its challenges, and we are so honored to be joined by a distinguished expert and certainly among the most respected voices in the academic and policy communities in Asia, former Secretary General of ASEAN, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. A little bit about our speaker. Ambassador Ong is Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS, at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is concurrently director of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at RSIS. He continues to hold the position of ambassador at large at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is also Singapore's non-resident High Commissioner to Pakistan and non-resident ambassador to Iran. Ambassador Ong has been the chairman of the Singapore International Foundation since 2015. Ambassador Ong was also High Commissioner of Singapore to Malaysia from 2011 to 2014 and served as High Commissioner of Singapore to India and concurrently Singapore's ambassador to Nepal from 1996 to 1998. Ambassador Ong served as the 11th Secretary General of ASEAN from January 2003 to January 2008. From 2008 to 2011, he served as the director of the Institute of Policy Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Before I turn over to our distinguished speaker, just a little disclaimer. All remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record, and we are live, not just through the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of that. So, without further ado, let me turn over to our guest speaker, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. Sir, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah. First of all, let me thank the university for inviting me and have all of you to listen to me in the next 10 minutes or so. I welcome your comments and questions. I think it is better for me to respond to as many comments and questions than for me to just continue talking. You have introduced ASEAN, and as you correctly pointed out, there are many who have somewhat not so positive attitude about ASEAN. And I always attribute that to what I call lack of awareness about what we are doing in ASEAN. And also, to a certain extent, there is a lot of wishful thinking for ASEAN to do more than what ASEAN is constituted to do. Yeah. Uh, Very often, the question that is posed to me is that why can't ASEAN be more proactive? Why ASEAN cannot do this or that? Especially when we have so many unforeseen challenges popping up in Southeast Asia now and then. The fact of the matter is that the organization is an intergovernmental organization. Yeah, and every one of us in the organization is there because there are certain benefit of membership. There is a certain value in having more friends gather around a regional body, and then maybe our voice will be greater and all that thing. But at the end of the day, there will always be this tricky situation where something that we do in each of the individual ASEAN member states uh, is not deemed acceptable in other ASEAN member states. And the question then is, can the other ASEAN member states who don't agree with what has been done uh, come in to try to influence a particular outcome? And it is not possible because people say that we have the ASEAN way and ASEAN cannot intervene in internal domestic affairs, blah, blah, blah. But actually, this particular idea of having a national position, uh, especially when the government in the particular member state feel that they have to do certain things their own way in order to achieve certain national objective, is precisely the important value of the membership of ASEAN. Because, yeah, in contrast to say other regional organizations, when what they seem to have is the supranational dimension of decision making. So, in other words, certain countries have no authority or not enough uh, mandate to do certain thing on their own. They just have to follow what has been decided and agreed upon by the majority of members. So ASEAN is in that respect quite uncharacteristic for governmental bodies, and we can debate about this later on when we have the question and answers. But for now, it is something that we cannot do without. Yeah, some people think that they can forget about ASEAN membership, but others feel that it is impossible to progress as a group of Southeast Asian nation without the uh, ASEAN being around to handle some of the issues that the regional country require a regional body to do. Yeah. So let me just sketch a few things um, to set the discussion in a few minutes. Number one, I think the ASEAN countries have always placed a lot of emphasis on what they call leadership. We always say leadership matters in ASEAN. So sometimes we have difficult issues and there are different opinions, and the officials or expert may debate among themselves and disagree or agree, or they form into little small groups of pro and con, supporters. Yeah, but in the end, they will refer to the relevant ministers, and the ministers, if they cannot come to any consensus, they will go up to the leaders, the prime ministers or the president of the respective ASEAN member states. But the reason why we say leaders matters is actually going beyond that, because some of the issues really require the leaders of our ASEAN member state to engage the leaders of other country beyond ASEAN. For example, now we have the new Biden administration in the US, yeah, and it is well known that in some cases, President Joe Biden is familiar with some of our ASEAN prime ministers and ASEAN presidents, yeah, countries that he had worked with previously in the past. So they can be, uh, uh, on a very personal basis, pick up the phone, talk to one another, and then they lay the general principles to move a certain initiative and then ask the official to follow up. So this is quite important because ASEAN has this informality characteristic. We like to be, as informal as possible, and not just every time we have to schedule a meeting 2 years in advance, and then along the way we do certain things to get the leaders ready for the meeting 2 years down the road. No, uh, leadership matter means that on certain occasion, our leaders in the 10 ASEAN membership can just pick up the phone and talk to one another, or they can pick up the phone and talk to other ASEAN partners around the world. The second thing that I want to draw your attention is that, yes, the ASEAN diversity is a big headache for many of us at the official or working level, but it is also our strength because we have different national advantages, we have different national characteristics, which can be used for certain specific uh, situation, certain subjects require certain kind of expertise. For example, Indonesia, it is a huge archipelagic state, thousands of islands, just like the Philippines, and the mentality of running a country with so many thousands of islands is different from, say, the mentality of the government in Singapore, just one small island, a city-state, or for a government like Thailand or Myanmar, with such a historical background and all kind of challenges through the decades and centuries in the past. So this is the unique thing about ASEAN. Yeah, the leaders will try to use their speciality, their personal qualities to the hilt and try to get certain advantage for their own countries. But at certain time, they band together and try to negotiate with a big guy. Say, for example, when we were discussing with Russia about Russia joining the East Asia Summit, which is actually centered around ASEAN countries, we work together. Yeah, difficult question posed to us by the Russian president. Each of us in ASEAN, our governmental leaders, explain and clarify why it's done this way, why it cannot be done now, why it had to wait, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. The other thing that is important for ASEAN is really that ASEAN is basically essentially outward looking. We are actually producers of various kind of agricultural products, now more and more manufactured goods, and we are a famous tourist destination, every one of our country, right? So we need to trade with the world. We need to bring people to our region, to our respective country. And therefore, we have to be astute in working or connecting with the global community. Yeah. And in that respect, we cannot ignore some of the global activities. For example, now we have climate change. We have issues like how to deal with environmental degradation. And today we have this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic. So this kind of huge health threats. Yeah, in 10 years ago, we had the SARS and some other kind of communicable diseases in our region. So we in ASEAN must look out to the world And we hope that we can organize ourselves in a manner which allow the rest of the world to interact with us, to come to our region easily, and having a good feeling about working with ASEAN. The third thing I want to stress about ASEAN is that because of our outreach to the rest of the world, we are very multilateral, so we are devoted to multilateralism. And in interacting across so many different countries, what is essential is for us to have our rules, but our rules must also conform with what is there on the international stage. So we always stress this thing called rules-based in negotiating free trade agreement or negotiating all kind of international accords and other things. ASEAN country as a group uh, are committed to follow international law, international norms, international convention. Yeah, of course, there are times when one or two ASEAN countries try to have some tactical advantage and they play hard to get a little bit, but eventually we all go back to a rules-based order. So here we have this kind of ASEAN characteristics. We tend to be coming across like to each their own. Yeah, we tend to be quarreling among ourselves on certain issues, but actually many of these issues are very technical these days. Yeah, and we owe it to our respective nation to push the best gain that we can get from the support of the other ASEAN countries. Then what have you? We have this fantastic geography. As I say, we look out to the world, but actually we are in the middle of a lot of important global activities, maritime trade, movements of people across Asia and Middle East, and if you use the Pacific Ocean into the Americas. So the situation is always that each of our country try to gain the best out of the tactical, out of the geographical, out of their traditional activities. Yeah. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Yeah. Now the important thing is that today Southeast Asia is confronted with many new things. For example, IT development, yeah, digital development. We have all kinds of technologies and so on and so forth. But in the last 50 years or so, given the ASEAN emphasis on education and more skill training to prepare for the future, we can proudly say that generally speaking, ASEAN population is well equipped to handle what I call the digital era that we are now in. Digital era arising from IT development, arising from new technology, moving past the industrial ages that we have gone through in the past 2 centuries. Now we are on a threshold of something quite different. And yet our population, by and large, is ready, can do more. And the good thing is that the rest of the world recognizes this. And so we have this advantage of this wonderful advantage that we have, which is that the population of ASEAN is generally regarded to be youthful and familiar with technology, and we call ourselves IT savvy. So this will bring more industries, more businesses, and other kind of investment into our region. Now the question is, how do we maximize this? Do we keep quarreling about little things like small children looking for the best toys in their school or what have you? Or we sort of put aside some of these petty matters and say, the big thing is we want to strengthen ASEAN's economy as a whole so that we are very competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Yeah, and we have done that now with a few interesting ideas, like for example, we have a regional comprehensive economic partnership. This economic partnership allows us to team up with countries like China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. These are all economic powerhouses, and we have individual ASEAN plus one agreement with, say, China or with Japan or with Australia, with South Korea. But now we put them all together, we can say, hey, the same rule, the same consideration for one apply across the board, and there is a scale, economy of scale, a scale of good productive capability, good trading capability, and so on. So we are now really positioned for a very competitive, I would say very advantageous development for the next 10 to 20 years. Problem is that we still have political issues because some of our historical differences are not yet resolved. Our territorial disputes have not been settled, and so on and so forth. And as a former Secretary General of ASEAN, I would say that what we should do, therefore, is to try to manage this, because we cannot settle many of these things due to the nationalistic position or due to the complicated historical dimension. So what we have to do is to find a way to manage this. While we are having differences among one or two of our membership, it does not mean we cannot hold together as a group to look at the big things. So this is the challenge we will have to contend with. Yeah, can we manage our differences among the 10 of us? Can we manage our differences with the ASEAN external partners? Can we convince other people that ASEAN is competitive and well ready for the next era of growth and development, even though we may have a different kind of society and different type of governance compared to the developed nations in Europe and in North America? Okay, so we can talk a lot about these matters or all the other granular details. I'm sure your students and audience will have. I think I will stop here for now and await your comments and questions, and then I will elaborate a bit more with regard to some of the specific ASEAN challenges as we go along. Thank you, Jeffrey.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador, for walking us through the ASEAN processes and why it remains to be such an indispensable institution in our part of the world. A lot to unpack there. Having heard from our speaker, in a couple of minutes, I will turn to our audience for their questions. And if you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please wait to be called before speaking. And please state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, you can also post your questions on the Q&A tab. But if you're going to do that, please remember also to identify yourself by including your name and affiliation. So, Ambassador, just to jumpstart our conversation, let me ask the first question. And I guess we can begin with the issue of the hour, which is probably in the minds of a lot of people. There has been some attempt on the part of ASEAN members to play a role in the ongoing instability in Myanmar. Indonesia seems to be taking a leadership role in trying to gather regional views and present a common ASEAN position, if that is at all possible. There has been some reports that Jakarta is pushing for fellow ASEAN members to agree on an action plan that would hold Myanmar's military to its promise of holding elections in a year's time. Of course, criticisms immediately flowed that the leaked action plan seemed to be legitimizing the military's actions. This was, of course, the action plan was denied by the Indonesian government. But I wonder if I could press you on this. What do you think is the role of ASEAN in the ongoing crisis in Myanmar? And what does it say about ASEAN's core principle of non-interference in domestic affairs?
Well, number one, Jeffrey, I think the element of non-interference in the domestic or internal affairs of another ASEAN member state has to be somewhat qualified in contemporary developments. Now that ASEAN grouping is evolving towards what we call an ASEAN community, what happened in one part of ASEAN or in one country of the ASEAN membership will have a big impact or big effect on the other part of ASEAN or the other countries of ASEAN. So, as I mentioned earlier, we want to maintain our economic competitiveness, and we want to maintain our ability to handle all these challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic, which is actually a very global-wide health challenge. If we do not appreciate that ASEAN 10 countries can look at one another's development and where necessary offer helps, advice, and try to solve some specific national level dimension of the challenges, then we are not able going to get our viable community. In this particular instance, what has happened with regard to the governance and government system in Myanmar is seen by a lot of other people outside ASEAN as a challenge to the well-being of ASEAN as a community. Number one, we are in the middle of a big, huge, challenging health pandemic. Number two, we have been working on the basis that the democratization process in Myanmar is moving along. Yes, there are bumps here and there, but the philosophy is that it will be open, inclusive, and there had been an election and there have been certain outcomes. People may not be happy with all the results of coming out from the election, but then there is a process to deal with this, not just one part of the country saying that I don't agree with this and this is not a good one, therefore I take certain action. Now, today, this kind of action, you can say it is confined to Myanmar. The fact of the matter is that we are a community now, ASEAN community, based on the political pillar, based on the economic integration pillar, based on what we call social, cultural development and well-being of the whole region. Whatever happened now in Myanmar along the line that has taken place since the 1st of February has an impact on ASEAN. So it is not very wise to say that this is just domestic affairs and other people should stay out. Mm-hmm. What the Indonesian foreign minister has tried to do is along this spirit, that we are now a community. We are not trying to come to your home to rearrange the furniture in the living room. But what we are saying is that in order for us to be able to visit you or for you to visit us, as we are doing before this 1st February development, we have to give you our opinion and we can offer our help where you think is applicable. We are not interfering. We are just worried about how the whole ASEAN group, which is now a community, will look. And on top of that, we have an ASEAN Charter. Before the community came about, we operate on what we call political and cooperative spirit. But now we have some written formulation in the charter. We can call it constitutional provision. And there are some good general principles. So most of us in ASEAN feel that, all right, it's your own house. I can't come and tell you how you arrange your furniture or your food preparation in the kitchen. But overall, if you don't do it well in arranging your furniture or preparing your food in the kitchen, it might affect all of us next to you or in the neighborhood. So I think at the end of the day, it is the spirit behind our interest in what has happened. It is not to say I impose my idea on you and this is the only way you should do it. But what we are saying is that, hey, there is a problem here, and I think we have to work together to find a way to avoid a deterioration or to avoid further infringement of what we have earnestly developed since the beginning of the ASEAN community building, which is about 2015. We formally established our ASEAN community. So that's the spirit, And I think Indonesia is exercising its diplomatic effort. Of course, in the process of trying to discuss things and proposing how to move forward, there are different ideas. But what we say in ASEAN is something that what we say in ASEAN internal meeting is something that I would like to mention here. In our ASEAN internal meeting, we propose ideas and then we brainstorm around. But it doesn't mean that that is the only thing that is on the table. We are just tossing ideas and finding whether this particular proposal can rally people and move it along. If it can does so, okay, it's a good idea. We can grow it a bit. But if it is not practical or not acceptable because of specific issues, in this case in Myanmar, okay. So we avoid that kind of ingredient anymore. For example, the issue here is whether there should be a new election, right? So there is a different opinion. Some say the election had just been held and there is no need for a new election and so on and so forth. But others feel that it might be the way forward. So what this means that a lot of ideas are on the table. Well, we need to sit down and say what is doable, what get more support from the community, and if we can get enough of the ASEAN membership to support such a proposal, then we put it to the people in Myanmar and say, hey, out of 10 of us, you are the one having this problem. So 9 of us, 6 of us think that this may be the way to go to secure the interests of the community. How about it? Of course, you can say no. Yeah, it is just like we are discussing what to do for the weekend. As a university student, should we go and have a movie or should we go to Disneyland in Tokyo or what have you? So this is what I would consider a rather mature way of handling our specific problems in a group.
Mhm.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think due to the taking of somebody's idea in isolation, it come across as something atrocious. Yeah. But I'm just speculating because I am not privy to the work of Foreign Minister of Indonesia. But I'm just saying that from past ASEAN diplomatic activities, we do come across this kind of situation where certain ideas are for maybe like you call it what, a trial balloon, yeah, or examine the possibility. One of the great things in ASEAN, Jeffrey, is that many things are actually quite innovative, yeah, and we try it and it works. We basically jump onto the bandwagon. But if it doesn't work, okay, we get some flack. People will scold us or scold the proponent of the idea. But it doesn't mean that we are now not talking to each other anymore. So this is the nature of a mature gathering of like-minded countries. And I think we are all like-minded because of geography, because of our history and our future prospects.
Right. All right. I'm sure our audience have other questions related to many other important issues like the ASEAN-China Code of Conduct in South China Sea, economic integration, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, U.S.-China strategic rivalry, among many others. So let's turn to the audience. I think we have a couple of questions in the queue. We have one here from Gilang Kembara from CSIS Indonesia. I think this is related to what you've been discussing. Uh, he argues that member states openly disregard the ASEAN Charter in the name of national progress, political stability, and/or economic prosperity. For example, he cited here the coup d'état in Thailand in 2014, the 2017 opposition crackdown in Cambodia, and the 2021 Myanmar coup. So his question is, has the ASEAN Charter become irrelevant in the current political dynamics? And how do we enforce the Charter to be applicable across the 10 member states?
I don't think the ASEAN Charter has become irrelevant. It's like us growing up when our father tell us, okay, son, you have to do these things. Yeah. I don't want you to spend your weekend in the football field. I want you to be in your school library. And you don't agree. Yeah. Then what you do? You don't go home anymore? uh, or you try to understand where your father is coming from and what is the purpose of he telling you you should be doing more study rather than playing in the football field. So the same thing here, when we have an ASEAN Charter, uh, we have a team of ASEAN officials and ASEAN leaders, ministers and head of state, head of government, and subsequently through the democratic process or through other means of changing government and finishing your term in the position of power and leadership, other people come. And they are not socialized enough about things called the ASEAN Charter or things called the ASEAN family. So this is something, Jeffrey, we have to ask ourselves. We tend to focus so much on how to conclude trade agreement, how do we make sure everybody follow the international rule, what to do about multilateralism. We have not done enough of socializing our own people. A political party in one country, one ASEAN country, may become the new government, but because it has not gone through the ASEAN process of working on an ASEAN Charter, they don't give it enough weight or don't give it enough priority. Yeah. So this is a big, big issue. ASEAN community building is progressing based on a specific set of action in a blueprint. But what you need to do is every member country of ASEAN have to do a lot of work on the ground in their home ground, socializing the people, socializing new parties to be in the government on what is the meaning of ASEAN and how do we work here and there. You know, I remember when I was Secretary General and we were really talking about getting the text of the ASEAN Charter to the leaders of ASEAN for endorsement at the end of 2007. When I visited one country in ASEAN, the central banker of the country told me she has not even seen a draft of the ideas that we are going to have in the ASEAN Charter. I said, how can that be? Next month we are having the ASEAN Summit and the leaders are going to approve this charter. Yeah? So I showed her some of the provision in the charter and she was shocked. Yeah? So there you have it. The issue is really each of us on the ground must make an effort. Because we change our officials, we change our political decision maker because of our democratization process, because of our semi-democratization process. But it means that we really have to alert everybody and get everybody into what I call same page, if you like. So yes, there will be challenges, as Mr. Gilan put it. It is important for us to continue to work on this, and with a bit more concerted effort. Yeah, you know, some of our national ASEAN secretariat for each of these ASEAN member states, some of them have no connection with certain ministries or certain NGOs or certain segment of their population in their home country because they are so bogged down with just getting the day-to-day requirement for this ASEAN meeting going. Yeah,
Right.
and they don't have the time to go out there to tell their own population or their own people this is happening and we have to do X, Y, Z. So it is going to be a while when everyone in ASEAN remember that we have an ASEAN Charter and what it means to follow the Charter. But that doesn't give us the excuse to say, now that we did certain thing and other countries say this is against ASEAN Charter, we don't care. You don't care means you are not interested in being an ASEAN member. Then the rest of us will have to ask ourselves, in that case, is it a case of not enough awareness or socialization, or they basically have a different philosophy or outlook for the future? If that is the case, then we might as well do certain things which some academic are advocating now. If you are not willing to be a member in ASEAN, you go on your own. But everybody wants to be a member of ASEAN because ASEAN is a very interesting creature. It helps you, especially when you are facing a big country
Right.
outside of ASEAN. Collective voice is stronger, you have good company, and on other time, you can use an excuse of ASEAN membership not to do certain things. So this is what ASEAN is about. It is an excuse. You are late for work or you are late for your date. You tell your girlfriend, because ASEAN work require me to do X, Y, Z. So I'm very sorry. We're all part of ASEAN. Blah, blah, blah. It's a great excuse. But at the same time, we have laid down all the necessary framework to have a basic construct of a regional body which can be made to function more effectively.
A lot to unpack there. We have two alumni who happen to be studying now at RSIS, Dong Xuan Fan and Edwin. Uh, they were my students before, and now they are there in Singapore studying or doing their graduate studies at RSIS, and they have pretty similar questions. One is from Edwin. He asked about the possibility for ASEAN to stay non-aligned in the age of U.S.-China's rivalry, given that some member states are reliant on China for trade, and I would argue some are reliant on the United States in terms of security. Fan has a question that is more specific to the South China Sea, and that is about the divergent interest and divergent threat perceptions of ASEAN members on the dispute. How can ASEAN as a whole or the ASEAN claimants themselves strengthen the bloc's unity on this issue in dealing with external powers? And you have mentioned that in your remarks a while ago that ASEAN is stronger as a bloc when it deals with a stronger, bigger power out there.
Okay, I think we have to be a bit more differentiated. I think the general narrative today in most ASEAN capital is that we don't like to take sides. Yeah. But what is said in statement and what is said in pronouncement will not necessarily be what is similar in terms of real action. Yeah. In other words, you do come across scholars who say what is said is one thing, what you do is another thing. Yeah. So at certain time, what we say, all of us follow the line because that is useful. At certain time, we cannot all follow the line based on what we said because you need to do certain things. Like, for example, if you are next door to China, or you have an agreement with the United States of America, yeah, like in the case of the Philippines or in the case of some Singapore cooperative arrangement with the US, how do we deal with this? When, say, China or Japan or India or some other guys will say, hey, maybe you should not do this. But we have already agreement. So what is said is one thing, what is done is another thing. Yeah. And the question that we have to ask is, how much can we get away with it? Sometimes we are saying that we don't take sides, but we favor a certain proposal from a particular big country more than what other big countries would prefer. But those who object to this idea or this proposal may eventually learn to live with it. Yeah. So it is a great thing about diplomacy. We maneuver in a manner which allow us to have a certain strategic autonomy without breaking the vehicle. We are all traveling on a bus. You cannot ask the bus to go over a sandy beach because it is not designed to run on sandy beach, but they are running on a well-constructed highway. Yeah. So I understand what is being asked. Yeah. In the case of South China Sea, for example, if you want to be purely technical about it, you will have to be said either you are for the Chinese position on South China Sea or you are for your own national position on the South China Sea, especially those claimant states in the South China Sea from ASEAN group. Or in the case of Singapore and other non-claimant states like Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, what do? We follow the international principles. Yeah, and international principles which are beneficial to ASEAN as a group. So it is important for us to bear in mind what is strategy, what is tactic, what is said, what is done. Yeah, and from time to time, we need to explain why we do certain things which we say or we imply we will not do in certain narratives. But yet we feel compelled to do it because at the end of the day, for those countries who have a democratic government, they have to answer to their people. So again, this is where the leadership matters, how they explain it, how they cultivate the understanding of the population, seeing the big picture in certain cases, going down to the very granular, the minute detail where needed. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is, do we want to be part of ASEAN? If we want to be part of ASEAN, we have to find a way to rationalize some of what we say we don't do, but we're actually doing it. Yeah. So all in all, there is no what I call straight answer to this. To be very frank, yeah, since I am taking this attitude, I want to be candid with all of you. Yeah. Where we can, ASEAN 10 will stick together. Where we cannot, you will see some cases, some member state of ASEAN doing a bit of a side activities. Oh, some of them may even say, okay, I am not coming to the meeting, but I'm going for some other outing with some of my friends from across the other side. Yes, sure. But as long as you don't ditch ASEAN altogether, so this concept of ASEAN centrality is very important. You are now wearing the ASEAN cloth just because you have a wild weekend with some people from the other grouping. It doesn't mean that you drop all your ASEAN clothes and but the other side is not prepared to give you their clothes, so you will end up with no clothes. So you have to be clever about this.
Right. We have one raised hand from our dean, Akitoshi Miyashita. Akitoshi, go ahead, please.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong, for your presentation. My name is Akitoshi Miyashita. I'm a professor of international relations and dean of the English track program here at TIU. I want to ask you a follow-up question about South China Sea. This is going to be a hypothetical question, but as we all know, China has become very, very active in South China Sea, sending more, patrolling boat, Coast Guard. And one possible outcome may be that countries like Philippines or the Vietnam, the fishing boats may be, the captain would be arrested by the Coast Guard personnel. Something that happened in 2010 between Japan and China, where the Japanese Coast Guard arrested the Chinese fishing boat captain. If the similar incident happened, and the Philippine or the Vietnamese fishing boat captain has been captured, arrested by China's Coast Guard, do you think that ASEAN should take a collective action by, say, issuing a formal protest, or do you think that ASEAN as a collective entity should remain silent?
I don't think ASEAN will do the proactive act that you suggest. Yeah. But I don't think ASEAN will accept the implication of the action under the Chinese Coast Guard behavior. What do you have here? we have a Coast Guard. Coast Guard, as I understand the meaning of the term, is for your own internal territory or your territorial waters. It's a law enforcement agency. It is not a law implementation or not a new part of the Navy or what have you. So it is important for us to say that, look, yeah, I can't stop anyone from creating new power for the Coast Guard. But what is the applicable law here? Are we talking about the law of China applying to this region where the incident took place? But this region where the incident took place is still not a settled uh, part of China or settled part of any other country. It is still in dispute. Yeah, and China is a member, is a signatory to the UN Law of the Sea Convention, so we have to follow the law. You may have an opinion about whether that UN Law of the Sea Convention is applicable, or you may have an opinion about whether this particular area where the incident took place is in or out of Chinese jurisdiction. But they are unsettled questions, and if we resort to this kind of unilateral move, then everybody else can also be unilateral. And at the end of the day, other people can also do the same thing to other Chinese interests elsewhere in the region. So I think it is important for us to stick to principles. And that's why we say in ASEAN, we follow this thing called the rule of law. Yeah. Until we sign on to a particular convention or agreement, we may still have a certain maneuverability. But once we are on as a signatory or as a member to a particular convention, we have to follow. You may disagree with it, but let us negotiate how can we converge the two opposing positions with regard to how this law apply or how should be the meaning or what should be the meaning of this particular provision. So now, Professor, in this particular case, I think the best thing to do is that whoever is in charge of that position that do not gel with the Chinese position must speak up, must go into the what I call the international community to ask for clarification. We should not just accept certain things. A lot of our countries around the region or elsewhere in the world can introduce a lot of new things. And if they are not in line with many things that we have already accepted as international norms or international ruling or international principle, we have to speak up. Yeah. And if we don't, then over time, by what you call just lack of resistance or lack of people who have a different action or different idea, it become accepted. Then that will be very, very bad for all of us. So I think in this case, we will have to continue to engage diplomatically. We have to explain more and more of the implication of these to all levels of our respective countries' commercial interests or what have you. Yeah, I don't want to get into the technicality of that particular framework which the Chinese side have put across, but I think if it is going to be applicable to cases where there are still ongoing dispute, it need to be we all need to be engaged and discuss how do we go about it.
All right, we're almost.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Miyashita. We're almost out of time, so let's steer the conversation a little bit on to economics. We have some related questions there, but let's talk about RCEP. You've mentioned this in your remarks. Late last year, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is the world's largest trade agreement. It was an ASEAN initiative, and there was a lot of hype, right? Experts have emphasized the fact that the United States is outside of it, China is in it, that it has low standard, etc. So, RCEP, is this much ado about nothing, or is this truly a transformational free trade agreement? What do you think? And related to that, one of our professors, Professor Medler Mema, has a question. And then let me just read this. In 2015, ASEAN member states formed the ASEAN Economic Community with the aim of fostering a single market, industrial production capacity, etc. How do you evaluate the work that has been done over the last 5 years? And how do you see its prospects in the near future? So
Jeffrey, the RCEP is something that never existed before.
Mm-hmm.
So by just this idea of having a new piece of paper, calling itself the RCEP, and saying that 15 countries have signed on to it, is already a big deal. I feel that if people sit down and examine the various pages in the RCEP, they can find quite a few new things. Yeah. But the nature of human being is always to look at the more disagreeable part of anything, and then we highlight it. Okay, so it is not a perfect document, but it is a beginning, and we're supposed to have a bit more what I call uniformity, because I mentioned earlier, ASEAN, we have separate free trade agreement with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, New Zealand, India. And they were signed in different years when certain things were not so popular or when certain things have become passé. So when you are a businessman and you want to look at it and say, wow, how do I do this? We have an ASEAN-Japan agreement, but then that was signed many, many years ago. And then we have an ASEAN-India agreement. And then if my factory is in India and I want to send to Japan, what particular goodie that I can get out of it? So at the minimum, RCEP has brought all of us to almost a common starting point. And where we make progress is to say that beyond agreeing to come together, we say that this particular new formulation apply to trade in goods, and now we accept it in all the ASEAN countries plus the other 6 additional countries. India had actually in negotiation agreed to everything, but it was a political decision not to sign on yet because of domestic consideration in India. So for all practical purposes, I always like to say that the document called RCEP has been agreed to by all the negotiators from ASEAN 10 plus the 6 other dialogue partners of ASEAN, namely China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. Number 2, I think there are some new things in the RCEP. For example, we, through our long months of negotiating, we come to more understanding about the meaning of e-commerce. What is the implication? What do we need to do about this? Yes, we continue to buy and sell things like sugar, pineapple, bananas, rice, and what have you. But hey, at the rate we are going, we will have what we call artificial banana soon. Or we may have sugar from non-cane source. No more sugar cane, but sugar from other sources. Now we can get a hamburger without actually getting the real beef. So you see, these are the things that are new, and there has been discussion on how do we tackle some of these, what we call 21st century products and 21st century trade development. But from what I can understand, looking at what has already been achieved, it is useful because there is a convergence of ideas among all the officials from the 16 ASEAN and ASEAN partner countries. Yeah, AEC is important because ASEAN as a group going to talk about ASEAN, Japan, ASEAN, China, ASEAN, Australia, ASEAN, New Zealand, ASEAN, Korea, and also ASEAN, India. So if we don't comply with the blueprint to finish our ASEAN economic integration, basically we are just a paper tiger. Yeah? ASEAN Centrality is useless. And after some time, you can be sure some guy in China or in Australia would say, hey, this is nonsense. It's just a hollow idea, because ASEAN 10 has not yet come to a conclusion with regard to this particular provision in the RCEP. So we cannot fool around. ASEAN Economic Community is the basis of ASEAN strength and ASEAN ability to be a very fulfilling part of this thing called RCEP. And if we don't execute the ASEAN Economic Community blueprint, we will basically lose our weight inside this new partnership across the region.
All right, we're out of time, but with the indulgence of Ambassador Ong, let's probably go for the last question from Professor Sojin Shin. Professor Shin?
Okay, thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. Well, I had the privilege to have met you several times before, and thank you again for joining us today. Well, and thank you for picking up India as an important partner for ASEAN members. I have a question about the role of ASEAN, or the problem of SAARC, actually, which can learn the lessons from the ASEAN. Well, as a scholar working on South Asia, I have involved a number of academic discussions promoting the role of South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, of which members include India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. And almost all the time, we tried to learn the successful experience from ASEAN and the idea of ASEAN Centrality. So like ASEAN, SAARC member countries have a various socio-political cleavage, such as different ethnic groups or religion or language, political history, interest, and conflict, and others. Despite such similarities of diversity, ASEAN has promoted the members and regional peace and economic development quite successfully, which SAARC has struggled substantially. So I understand you have the extensive experience in India and Nepal as the ambassador of Singapore. So I would like to hear more about your observation on the problems of SAARC member countries and what actually South Asia and SAARC members can take from the ASEAN model. Thank you.
You know, Sojin, I have spent 5 years at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, and I lived 5 years among Indonesians during the period. I think it is a very important point here. Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, but when we got going on ASEAN, the Indonesian leadership, the Indonesian population went into this in a very sincere manner. They basically minimized Indonesia in order to have a regional organization called ASEAN. The challenge in South Asia is that India is so huge, and like all big countries, they do not have time to molly-collie smaller neighbors, But if you don't want to embark on such kind of effort, then it's very difficult to form a regional organization. You can say that there is a SAARC in South Asia, but actually people will say it is an Indian organization, making sure that all the other smaller countries in South Asia are there. And every once in a while, you have a meeting to listen to the big guy telling us all what to do. So the success of ASEAN was a very historical development. The timing was excellent. 5 original ASEAN members came together and worked something out. There was a common challenge back in the 60s and 70s, namely the Cold War, and then there were the threat of communism and other things. Well, but at the end of the day, you look at the history of ASEAN, it is how the biggest country in Southeast Asia decided to put aside its natural tendency to be big and influential and to work with all the smaller neighbors. So in the case of South Asia, India will have to do more. But India is a democracy well before Indonesia has become a democracy. So it is a very time-consuming process. The Indian political leadership will have to always spend a lot of planning and a lot of time to get all factions in the Indian polity to agree to certain things that the leadership in New Delhi would like to do for the region. So this is a big challenge. Democracy also brought about intolerance. And intolerance in democracy can become the force that rule the day. So, however, it doesn't mean that the countries in South Asia should not try. In fact, on one thing, South Asia is more successful than ASEAN. ASEAN, as you all know, does not have many institutions. But in the case of South Asia, SAARC has an important SAARC institution in every SAARC country. So I think this is something we can learn from the South Asian cooperation. Each person or each country has a piece of the cake. Here in ASEAN, our main philosophy is not to institutionalize ASEAN. It is better to come together, 10 of us, huddle, make a decision, rather than to say, I have a center for this in Singapore, I have a center for that in Laos, I have a center for this action in Philippines or what. In addition to the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. When we are ready for that, I think ASEAN will be a greater organization. But in the case of SAARC, it is still not enough to have the cake divided up among all the SAARC countries at this moment. I think it is important for the biggest country, namely India, to find a way to have a domestic consensus, political consensus, so that India will come across as the benevolent nation, big, but having the regional agenda also on its national list of things to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong. Very interesting, insightful, and engaging conversation on ASEAN and many regional issues. Thank you again for your time and insights. A lot of takeaways from this dialogue. As a junior scholar, it's a personal privilege and honor of mine to facilitate this discussion with you as our guest speaker. On behalf of Tokyo International University and my co-conveners of this dialogue series, Professor Chris Lamont and Professor Sojin Shin, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. Special thanks also to our participants for joining us this afternoon. Please stay tuned for TIU Global Dialogue number 7 on March 10th. From Southeast Asia, we move to Western Balkans and talk about China's influence in Central and Eastern Europe. So please register for that as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.